Thank you, Simon. Or at least, I think, thank you, Simon. Probably a little bit like political careers, talks on the Middle East always end in failure to some extent. It's a complicated topic, though many contexts are complicated. But unlike most contexts, this is one where people have extremely strong views. The organisation I used to work for, Embrace the Middle East, launched an appeal in 2021 for Gaza, purely focused on humanitarian work in the Gaza Strip. And of the first 460 comments on social media, only 4 were positive. That doesn't happen with any other context. So when I'm preparing this and I'm thinking somehow I need to represent and honour the suffering of people in that part of the world, also try and honour as we move into Advent the one who was made flesh and dwelt among us, not just anywhere, but in this land, in the Middle East, I feel like there is no way to do this justice. There is no way I can satisfy this topic in the next few minutes. I am, however, grateful for the much more generous amount of time than I've normally had in the past when speaking at churches, so thank you for that. I should also probably say that, as well as people in general being hugely invested, I am hugely invested. I earlier was hoping I could get to the end of this talk without crying. I didn't even get to the end of Graham Kendrick without a tear in my eyes for this. It's a topic. I lived in Bethlehem in the West Bank in Palestine, 2011, 2012, in Nablus in 2004 during the Second Intifada. I have researched Palestinian Christians, in particularly the Syriac Orthodox population in the West Bank. And until a few years ago, this was really the main focus of my professional work. Latterly, it's moved more towards Iraq and Afghanistan. But this is something that I'm very committed to, and it's important to recognise that because there isn't a view from nowhere on this. There's no overarching narrative that we can all kind of package and go home and think, final word, job done. And because of that, and because it's so hard to know even where to begin, I think rather than diving into an analysis or a historical account, I was kind of thinking about what kind of genres of scripture enable us to connect with the deeper reality of what's going on there. And that's why I chose the Job reading, because I think scripture gives us this tradition of lament, and I want us to begin there. First of all, Lamentations 1. I can only see myself. Is it possible for me to see the slides? Toby, thanks a lot. Lamentations 1, which is on the next slide, begins, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are on her cheeks." In Hebrew, the word for the book of Lamentations is ekah, which is the first word of the book, how. There's not a simple translation for ekah. It can mean how deserted lies the city, but it also probably works better untranslated as like a sigh, like an onomatopoeia. Ekah, deserted lies the city. It's like the process of lamentation kind of begins with this wordlessness, this structured sigh. And that to me seems like the most appropriate starting point when we think 14,000 people in Gaza have been killed in recent weeks. 14,000, most of them children and women. 1,400 Israelis were killed in the streets of their communities, in their own homes on October the 7th, and many families have been ripped apart and are yearning for, is my loved one going to be coming home over the next few weeks, or are they dead? Each of these 14,000, 1,400, 15,500 stories deserves to be told in full. It deserves all of our emotional resources. And of course, we can't offer that. So where do we go? I think ekah is the most appropriate response. So I just want to kind of pray in that spirit of ekah first before we even begin, really. Ekah. God, how can this be? Ekah. Decades of occupation, years of blockade, the world's largest prison. Ekah. gunmen massacring families, children in their homes. Eka. Powerful people using the language of atrocity, human animals. Eka. Bombs raining from the sky, destroying homes, breaking bodies, breaking futures and childhoods and communities. Eka. 15,000 lives cut short in 6 weeks, on top of the millions displaced, devastated this year and over the past century. Eka. With this cry we offer our own wordless pain, our bewilderment, and our neighbours' inexpressible suffering. Eka, how can this be? With this cry we express our world's endless groaning and our lingering hope in the silent one. Eka. And on behalf of those affected, on behalf of all the innocent victims of this horror and this injustice, and on behalf in particular of Palestinian children and Israeli children whose lives are being ruined in a conflict that was begun by long-dead adversaries, we pray with the words of Psalm 35, Lord, you have seen this, do not be silent. Eka and Amen. So, we started with wordlessness. Time starts now, by the way. How do we now move to words? How do we begin to formulate words for this? In the Western Church's calendar, today is Christ the King Sunday, which is quite a new festival, a new feast for which the gospel reading is typically the exchange between Pilate and Jesus about power and truth. And of course, Jesus proclaims, yes, he's a king, but he's a king from a different kind of kingdom, and his followers are not going to rush in and violently liberate him. This morning I was in the cathedral and I was struck by the closing prayer after communion. It read, Christ the King, with joy we have offered thanksgiving for your love in creation and have shared in the bread and the wine of your kingdom. By your grace, plant within us a reverence for each other and the courage to choose your way of life, ruled by love to your praise and glory. A reverence for each other and the courage to choose your way of life. And suddenly, I felt I knew how I was going to frame this evening's talk after the past 10 days wondering about it. I think the logic of the kingdoms of this world is based on fear, is based on the exclusion of the other or control of the other. And in place of courage to live together, as Simon was praying, with all the risks that living together entails, lives governed by fear and the pursuit of security. And of course, the manifesto for Christ's kingdom is, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you. The poor, the hunger, the weeping, the hated, these are named as blessed by God through Christ himself. And the term blessed is a term we would typically reserve for God or for rulers or for the wealthy. It's a term of reverence. And so in Christ's upside-down kingdom, we are to revere those for whom the world, and the powerful in particular, has contempt. And of course, the past 150-ish years of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship has been marked very often by contempt, and certainly not by reverence. So, I'm now going to try and unpack some of the root causes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think there are two particular causes that I want to flag, primarily because they belong outside of that relationship. There are things that have happened to Israelis and Palestinians. One of them is Ottoman land reforms of the 19th century. You knew it was going to be an exciting talk. And the other is European anti-Semitism. Now, the 19th century is a long time ago, and when we get angry with people that we see on our TV screens, and I certainly do, it's worth remembering that the people that started this conflict are long dead, and that most of the people who we see as villains on whichever side of this conflict have been taught to hate to some extent, have been taught to have contempt for the other. If we could just skip through to the next slide. Actually, no, hold that slide, actually, that is useful. Let's talk about that first source, the land reforms. We won't go too deep into this, but basically the land of what some people call Palestine, what some people call Israel, is nourished by this water that is beneath the mountains that run from Jenin in the north, down through Nablus, through Ramallah, Jerusalem, Bethlehem and Hebron in the south. This is the deep water, the clean water, the uncontaminated water. And really, if you imagine that as the spine over millennia of this land, it sustains the life out to the east, to the Jordan, and out to the west, to the Mediterranean Sea. And that is the true wealth of this land. And it's worth bearing that in mind in terms of power and power relations in the area, which we'll come to. But what has happened over millennia, the earliest recorded agriculture in the world was on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Some of the earliest urban civilizations emerged here. And the whole character of this place until a couple of hundred years ago, even less, was the mingling, the pluralism, the diversity, whether it was through seasonal labor migrations from less fertile parts of the Middle East, or whether it was through war, or most of all, through trade. Trade, this is like the end of the spice routes. This is a place defined by trade and exchange. Now, moving to the mid-19th century. Next slide, please. The Ottoman Empire is ruling from Istanbul. This is Palestine, it's part of Greater Syria. This part of the world is divided into 4 different subdivisions, sanjaks: Jerusalem, Nablus, Safad, and Gaza, all kind of administrative areas. 85% of the population are Muslim, 11% are Christian, 4% are Jewish. All of them use Arabic in daily life. They're a cultural kaleidoscope. There is not yet a kind of Palestinian nation as such, but there are these ancient roots in the land and an indigenous community there. The place has been defined by these millennia of trade, this exchange I was talking about, and even the inland towns are characterized by mingling as well as the ports. Old families in Bethlehem, where I used to live, would trace their lineages back to the Crusades or the Islamic conquests or to the Byzantine era or even before into antiquity. And so there is this kind of ancient clustering of lives around this line of water divide in the middle of the land. Free movement in, free trade in and out is what made this land what it was, which was diverse and pluralistic and utterly compelling to Middle East buffs like me. But I want to focus now on how the land was managed. Basically, most of this land was effectively owned by the state, for want of a better word. And some quite considerable amounts of the land were owned by religious institutions as well. But in day-to-day life, the custodians would have been villages, peasant villages, where I knew that these trees were my family's trees, and this well was my family's well. And that was the neighbour's well, and that was the weird people down the street's well. You know, you just had a sense of, these are my trees, this is my land. And a bit like the kind of common grazings that we had in this country, to be honest. Then in 1858, with the stroke of a pen, all of that changed, but you wouldn't have necessarily noticed at the time. Imagine that my family was farmers in the north of Israel, as it is now, just south of Mount Tabor, land around Al-Fula. I would probably have been farming in 1859, much the same as I did in 1857, but the Ottomans had privatized this land. They had sold this land to an absentee landlord in Beirut called Mr. Sursuk. He was now sending his people to collect rents rather than the empire sending their people to collect taxes. And of course, we paid them. My interests remained. Hopefully, I'd have enough surplus to feed my family and enough to pay these guys to go away. But whether it was rents or taxes didn't really affect me at the time, and life continued much as before. But as I say, with the stroke of that pen, the right of those peasants to remain on that land had been removed. Here we see contempt again, not reverence for the Arab peasant farmer. And frankly, that is the fundamental reality that weaves its way through the past 170 years since then, from all the elites, including many of the Arab urban elites as well. So that's one of the sources of the problem. The other, of course, is European anti-Semitism. As the 19th century drew on, it became very clear to many Jews in Europe that modernity and industrialization wasn't solving the problem of their minority status in Europe. At first, it was a very liberal, secular, urban movement called Zionism, which basically said, we need our own homeland wherever it is, and they considered parts of Africa, Uganda, for instance, as well as the Indian subcontinent. And many people at the same time were having these thoughts: Kurdish aspirations, Assyrian aspirations, Bosnian and various Slavic aspirations for a homeland were emerging around this time. Some were successful, some were not. But obviously Jews have a connection to this land. Every Passover they pray next year in Jerusalem. And then suddenly, through the emergence of Zionism, there was this possibility that maybe this could actually happen, and the fulfillment of this secular aspiration to a homeland free of anti-Semitism could be realized alongside this deep-rooted spiritual connection to the land. But it wasn't very simple. Two rabbis visited the land in 1897, sent to basically case the situation, to assess it. And they wrote back, "The bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man." So Zionism was divided from the start on what do you do with the non-Jewish population of the land, which at that point, as I say, was only 4% Jewish. And today, they're still divided on that question. But early Zionist immigration into the land was largely uncontentious. It was mostly into urban areas like Safad, Tiberias, Jerusalem, where there was already an established Jewish population. And they bought the land, moved in, and basically most people who would have been involved in trade in the land at that point would have experienced interactions with Jews as well as Muslims and Christians. But things began to change with what was called the second Aliyah, the second wave of Zionist immigration. Now imagine my imaginary family tilling that farm in Al-Fula, and the year now is 1908. Unbeknown to me, the ownership has just changed again. Mr. Sursuk's son, Mr. Sursuk bought it from the Ottomans, and Mr. Sursuk's son now owns the land. He's just sold it for a big profit. It's really helped his big house in Beirut, and he sold it to Zionist immigrants. And then come 1910, I know about it, because my family and myself and the whole of my community has been forced off that land at the end of a gun. Again, the peasant experience is one of experiencing contempt and not reverence. And that's because these European immigrants believe in the principle of Jewish labor, reclaiming the land for Jews exclusively. They want this land, they want that ancient aquifer that's beneath those mountains, and they want it to sustain their people, not us. Contempt, not reverence. And for me, this is the moment when those two fundamental sources come together and we see the start of the cycle of violence that we are still living with today. In the decade after that, in the 1910s, we see the emergence of the Palestinian nationalism, Palestinian national cause, and anti-Zionism. We see urban intellectuals suddenly seeing what's happening to peasants in places like El Fula and developing newspapers and activist groups and so on, and resisting this process of immigration more widely and displacement specifically. But who do they complain to? At this point, the Ottoman Empire is losing its grip, and so the cycle of violence has begun. I'm going to try and rattle through now the last 100 years since then. Peace to end all peace is the next slide. After World War I, Britain was given the mandate for Palestine, and they became the target of lobbying from both sides. It was the victim of overpromising. It had promised in the Balfour Declaration a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It had come up with a deal with the French called the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide all of the region, and it issued the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, which promised Arab independence in the limits and boundaries proposed by the Sharif of Mecca, which included Jerusalem. So when people, as you sometimes hear, blame Britain for the conflict, that's what they're talking about. The mandate, due largely to that duplicitousness, nobody trusts the British when they were in control, entailed largely failing to control Zionist terror groups that would attack British and Arab interests, Arab, anti-Zionist and sometimes anti-Jewish riots, and this kind of spiraling violence. And then, of course, we get to the Shoah, the Holocaust in the 1940s, and there's a huge shock to the international system and a huge sense of sympathy for Jewish claims to a homeland. So the British rather ignominiously handed over the mandate to the United Nations, and they came up with the partition plan. We're a few slides. Next slide. Next slide. So I was forgetting I had slides. Here we go, partition plan. This is the map on the left. And this was basically the kind of separation solution. Zionists, with a tiny, they had a committee of 10 people, 6-4, they voted to unilaterally declare independence in 1948. They settled on the name Israel, but they did not define its borders at that point. And remember those rabbis' words, the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man. And remember that ancient mingling and that pluralism. This separation suddenly seems really unsatisfactory, even though with hindsight we might look back and think it would have been the lesser of many evils. But at that point, declaring independently and unilaterally an independent state was no light matter. And sure enough, Arab armies invaded immediately. All of them had their own interests. Jordan took the West Bank, Egypt took Gaza, and Syria was on the shores of the Sea of Galilee and the Golan Heights. But what that looked like for the average person. I met a guy in Bethlehem, a Syriac Orthodox guy. His great-grandfather had been kicked out of Turkey in the genocide in 1915. He took up refuge on the Hebron road between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. And then in 1948, he heard about the arrival of the Zionist armies. And so he locked his door. He went and took refuge in Bethlehem, which was thought to be much safer. And that was the last time he saw his home, or that was the last time he went back to his home. This story is repeated hundreds of thousands of times across the country. 750,000 people never returned to homes that they temporarily left due to war. And that's why the key, the next slide please, that's why the key is a symbol of Palestinian identity. Many have keys to homes that their grandparents or great-grandparents left, which they've never been able to visit. And that was the experience for urban dwellers. For fellahim, for the peasants, it was even worse. The majority of fellahim fled their villages or were forcibly evicted. And most of these were then accommodated in pretty grim refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria. More than a fifth of the Palestinian Arab population was forced out of historic Palestine into neighbouring countries. And in addition to that fifth, 250,000 fled into the Jordanian-controlled West Bank and 160,000 into Egyptian-controlled Gaza. This is what Palestinians call their Nakba, the catastrophe. And it's shot through with contempt, not reverence. The movement was two ways. Jews were also expelled from Arab countries. Ancient Jewish communities from Baghdad to Tunis were destroyed effectively. But the difference is there's not a pure symmetry here, because for the state of Israel, Jewish immigration was absolutely what they needed. This was going to build the Jewish state. Whereas for Palestinians, their hopes of return summed up in that key. Their hopes for return meant that they were actively opposing the option of citizenship in the countries they were taking refuge in. So with the exception of Jordan, still to this day, they're mostly languishing, largely stateless in these neighbouring countries. The next slide, the armistice of 1949 basically expanded the Jewish state and agreed what are still today the legally recognised borders between Israel and the occupied territories, although at that point it was occupied by Jordan and Egypt, not by Israel. The occupation of these territories by Israel began in 1967, and a further quarter of a million people were displaced out of the country at that point. And this was when they got control of the deep water resources, the mountain aquifer. By this point, the old Arab elite was discredited in the eyes of many Palestinians. They were throwing their lot in with the PLO that was formed by exiled intellectuals and young activists. And this is when you see the start, really, of Palestinian militancy. It's also the start of settlement activity, by which I mean when, Jewish citizens of Israel move into the land that is Palestinian under international law, or occupied under international law, but retain their Israeli citizenship. And it's an illegal process under international law, although Israel will dispute that. By the 1980s, see, I'm really rattling through now, settler numbers had reached 100,000, and Israeli politicians were warning that this was going to be a time bomb. Palestinians in these occupied territories had few civil rights. They faced daily harassment, state violence, and the loss of land, of course, to settlement. And so at this point, confidence in the PLO, too, was declining. Which is when we see the entry of Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, which was set up within the Palestinian territories by people who wanted to say that the Palestinian cause was not represented by these secular leftist factions, but by a return to principles espoused by the Muslim Brotherhood at first. And at first, Israeli officials have said that they supported, really promoted Hamas within the Palestinian population in order to weaken the PLO. And so this kind of emergence of this movement saw a further weakening of the credibility of the PLO. But much more significance even than that at that time was the emergence of local organising committees, civil disobedience activist campaigns, and this provoked Yitzhak Rabin's iron fist policy against the Palestinian national movement. This consisted of extrajudicial punishments, beatings, shootings, killings, house demolitions, the uprooting of trees, deportations, extended imprisonments without trial, and all of these are tactics that persist until this day. This led to the first Intifada, which was characterized by protests and civil disobedience and tax strikes, and mostly independent at first of the PLO and the major factions. And that Intifada, that kind of groundswell of popular activity, was a shock both to Israel and to the PLO and to the international community, and led, I'm skipping a few hoops here, to Oslo, the Oslo Accords. Now initially, we've heard of Oslo Accords, peace deal signed in the mid-90s. It was hugely popular on both sides. It had 100,000 Israelis marching in support of it in Tel Aviv. You had dancing on the streets of Gaza. How we would love that kind of symbol of solidarity and shared positivity today. But there were two problems at that time. First of all was a problem with the Oslo Accords itself. See, Israel got recognition there and then immediately. The PLO renounced violence. Israel was now their partner. A two-state solution was the only game in town. And Palestine, on the other hand, would get its state sometime down in the future, one day, inshallah. And so in the meantime, it was kind of carved into these different jurisdictions. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry. Carved into these different jurisdictions where the new Palestinian Authority had some control over these little islands of urban population. But in general, the kind of control of the territory, the pink area, Area C, was still fully in Israeli control. So that was the problem with the Oslo Accords itself. And there were dissenters on both sides. Famously, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now the Israeli Prime Minister, led a rally against Yitzhak Rabin. They were carrying a coffin and brandishing a hangman's noose. They were accusing Rabin of selling out the Zionist dream of conquest of the whole of the land of Israel. Netanyahu was even asked by the Israeli security services to just ratchet down the rhetoric because it was dangerous, and he declined. And then, of course, we know that Rabin was assassinated a few months later by an Israeli extremist. And then on the Palestinian side, Hamas rejected the deal. They said that basically Palestinians were having to wait for all of the goodies of peace, whereas Israel got it straight away. And sadly, they saw what happened next as vindication, because this was when settlement really grew in areas of the West Bank under Israeli control and adjacent to Palestinian villages and legally Palestinian land. And to this day, settler groups still attack Palestinian villages every day. This was worsening when I was living there just over a decade ago, but since the recent war kicked off in October the 7th, the average attacks on Palestinian villages by settlers has gone from 3 per day to 9 per day, and children are losing their lives because of this. It's pure vigilante violence. And while until a couple of years ago the State of Israel would condemn this violence officially, it has always been common to see Israeli troops standing right next to these vigilantes, protecting the vigilantes as they burn crops, even directly attack Palestinians, while refusing to intervene to protect the Palestinians. And farmers in Area C, I know Simon has planted or picked olives in the West Bank. Those farmers are at particular risk, which is why there are these trips to help and support them. Because if they don't have written deeds to their land dating back to the Ottomans or the British, it's very easy for that land to be claimed by the Israeli state or by settlers. And that's an incredibly high bar because of the way land ownership worked back in the 19th century. So by the end of the 90s, any Palestinian state that was being hoped for at the end of the Oslo Accords seemed like an absurd pipe dream. And this led eventually to the Second Intifada. Next slide. It led to the construction of the wall, to the growth of suicide bombing. First of all, the suicide bombing, and then the construction of the wall. And that wall, although it's based on a security rationale, very often divides Palestinian communities straight down the middle, or Palestinian communities from their agricultural land. So it's a de facto annexation of land as well. Next slide. I don't have time to talk about Palestinian Christians. That's actually what I know about. So we'll do another talk sometime on that. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions on that maybe afterwards. But next slide. Yeah, really that just gives you a sense of how that architecture of control looks. So basically, where are we now? So the settler population in the West Bank is now 700,000. And in Gaza, well, Israel withdrew its settlers from Gaza in 2006 and immediately imposed a blockade on the territory. And then when in 2008, Hamas won the popular elections, which were considered free and fair by the international community and obviously expressed the disillusion of the Palestinian population more generally. Instead of kind of practicing what we preach when it comes to democracy in the Middle East, the results of that election were denied. Fatah, the main part of the PLO, were allowed to govern the West Bank, and Hamas were allowed to govern Gaza, but as a blockaded territory where people aren't allowed to fish freely, they can't leave freely, anything coming in and out, food, goods, electricity, water, all controlled by Israel. And whenever they wish, that access to resources can be denied. So an 18-year-old living in Gaza today has only ever known blockade. They've only ever known worsening poverty, undrinkable water, a lack of job opportunities. 4 wars have shattered its infrastructure, emboldened militant groups, some of whom are more extreme than Hamas. Life is pretty much unbearable, and it was before 7th of October. So when Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, said this attack didn't happen in a vacuum, this is what he was referring to. Of course, it looked really different if your family fled the Holocaust, was able to move into one of these homes in Israel and build a good life for yourself. But sometimes I feel like the story that we hear in the media and even historical accounts, which focuses on treaties and political movements and power plays and international law, misses a really simple fact, which begins with that peasant farmer in El Fula. It's that Muslim and Christian Palestinians who have comprised the vast majority of the population at the turn of the 20th century have been forcibly and systematically and sadly decisively displaced from the land. They've been confined, as in Gaza or even in these islands within the West Bank, disenfranchised, delegitimized in their own land. And in many places today, they struggle even to hold on to their homes in places like the Christian quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. So if you're listening to this whistle-stop tour of the last 170 years and feeling hopeless, I think that's absolutely reasonable. We celebrate that there's a truce just now in this latest conflagration, but this still deals with the symptoms. It doesn't deal with the underlying causes of this conflict. So there is no earthly reason for hope. Amen. No, I'm not going to stop there. This year in Bethlehem, they've taken down the Christmas decorations, which are usually there all year long. Santa Claus at the bank in July. It's bizarre. But anyway, they've taken these decorations down because of the Gaza war. But even in normal times, Advent in Palestine is very different from Advent here. It's a time of fasting, first of all. And I think fasting connects us in a really profound way with an understanding of the incarnation, with Christmas, of who the Son of Man is, what he came for, how he rules, as expressed in the Beatitudes. And so I just want to end with a question of whether the lesson of the incarnation can give us just now a taste of that hope that somehow my Palestinian Christian friends, who I haven't spoken about tonight, seem to have. 2023 has seen us probably more grimly aware than ever of how much strain this kind of international peace that we'd largely taken for granted 20 years ago is under. In 1934, under another time of strain, Dietrich Bonhoeffer preached a sermon to an ecumenical conference in Denmark. And this is what he said, taking on the logic of the world at the time. That was, the Nazis were now in power, there was rearmament, there was vigilante violence against Jews in particular, there was a rising militarism. And he said this: "Peace on earth is not a problem, but a commandment given at Christ's coming." How does peace come about? Through a system of political treaties, through the investment of international capital in different countries, through the big banks, through money, or through universal rearmament to guarantee peace? Through none of these, for the single reason of them all, peace is confused with safety. There is no peace along the way of safety, for peace must be dared. It is the great venture. It can never be safe. Peace is the opposite of security. Peace as a commandment given at Christ's coming. In the reading from Job, I love that reading because it really is quite incoherent. It begins with complaint, then suddenly talks about the Redeemer standing on the earth, and then goes back to complaint. But that lament momentarily gives way. It's like the smoke clears momentarily to give a vision of a liberator standing among us. And Advent tells us that peace has a name and a body. That peace was born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. And the New Testament presents Christ as a free gift whom we simply accept. Peace is a free gift we simply accept. In a sense, all we have to do is acknowledge the presence among us of the one who is peace. But this simple acceptance, while also honestly engaging with the reality, with the horror of what has unfolded lately in Gaza and in Israel, has implications. Accepting that peace is the baby that was born among animals in a town under occupation gives us eyes that won't unsee the lie that peace can be secured through bloodshed. Accepting this peace on earth, despite what we see, has to bear fruit in the way we live. It has to bear fruit as a posture of reverence to those whose lives have been shattered, and a posture of resistance to unjust power, even when that unjust power claims security as its objective. And so with Bonhoeffer, who was killed for the implications of this claim, we have to acknowledge in the end there is no way to peace along the way of safety, for peace must be dared. It is the great venture. It can never be safe. Peace is the opposite of security. And so as we go into Advent, May the peace of the Lord be with us all.